articles on how to subnet an IP and what an IP address is. They go into a lot more detail. Mine is just a very brief introduction, and I'm going to show you a method on how to subnet an IP address. So what is an IP? Well, an IP is a unique identifier that all devices have. Okay? Think of an IP address as a street address and a house number that is unique to you, right? And there's two parts to that. There is a subnet portion and then there's a host, right? Like a street address and a house number. And usually an IP address is 32 bits long and is divided into 4 groups, or they're called an octet. So in this example down here below, I have 192.168.1.10. So 192 is broken down into 8 bits or 8 zeros. This could be ones and zeros, but this is just demonstration purposes. So there's 8 zeros, then dot 168, which is 8 bits or 8 zeros, dot 1, which again is 8 bits or 8 zeros, dot 10, okay, equaling 32 bits. So there are two types of IP addresses. There are global or public IP addresses, and they usually look something like this. And then there's a private IP or a local IP address. So if you do an IP config or if config on your machine, local at home, most likely you'll have a 192.168 dot something IP address there. So there's two types. There's a private and then there is public. And the public IP range are subdivided into different classes. There's a class A, and that range starts from 0 to 127. And there's a class B that begins with 128 all the way to 191. A class C, which starts with 192 all the way to 223, and then there's also a class D, which is used for multicast. The private IP range, they usually begin with class A, which is 10.0.0.0, a class B, which is 172.16.0.0, or a class C, which is 192.168.0.0. So most likely you'll see a private IP range in your corporation and at homes. So if you're in your corporation, your IP range will start with either a 10 dot something number or 172.16 something number. And if you're at home, they usually start with 192.168. And the private ranges are completely separate from the public one, okay? Because they're private to your network or to your home. So what is a subnet mask? Well, a subnet is a subnetwork or a smaller network within a large network. Okay, and a subnet mask is a 32-bit number, as we saw earlier. Okay, it's a 32-bit number that divides the IP address into the network address and the host address. So the subnet mask tells you which portion is the street address and which portion is the your house address, your house number. Basically, that's what a subnet mask does. Okay, pretty simple. And normally you'll see an IP address, and it has an annotation. At the end of it, it's called a CIDR notation, which stands for classless interdomain routing. So it's like a shortcut. So they'll do /27, /24, /whatever, right? So you'll have an IP address and there's a slash something at the end. Well, that slash something at the end is the subnet mask. Okay. So in this case, a /27. Well, we know that's 255.255.224. So to shorten it, instead of writing all this out, they usually do a /27 or do a CIDR notation. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We'll do some subnetting. All right, so I have created this Excel sheet. So the first thing you want to do is you write this out. Okay, it makes it easy for you. Just remember this. Remember these two sets of numbers. These two rows. Okay. First thing you want to do is you write this out. We're going to be subnetting this IP right here, 168.173.70.134/29, and we need to find out what the subnet mask is, what the network IP is, or the subnet IP. We need to know what the first available host IP that we can use, the last available host IP, and what is the broadcast IP. Now remember, every subnet or every network, right, has two portions of an IP that it reserves. One is the network portion, and then here's my broadcast. So the network ID is usually the first ID, and the broadcast is usually the last IP. And those two are reserved. You can't use those, but you can use everything else in the middle. So we need to find out for this IP what the subnet mask is, the network IP, and so on and so forth. So the very first thing you do is you create this little chart that I've created here. Okay. The first row, I wrote down 128. Next to it, I wrote down 192, then 224, 240, 248, 252, 254, and 255. Just memorize this, and you write this down. And these are the subnets, okay? Just memorize this. This is something that will help you. And underneath that, starting under 255 from right to left, you write down 1, then you write down 2, and the rest is just power of 2 as you go forward. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128. Okay? And as you can notice, they're right above each other, right? Underneath that, this is something that I do. This is just for my visualization purposes. If you remember earlier from the slide, I showed you that there's 32 bits, right? And there's 4 octets equaling 32 bits. So I write down 8 zeros, and after the first dot, I write down 8 to let me know that I just passed 8 zeros. Under the next dot, I write down 16. That tells me I've passed 16 zeros. And then the next dot is 24, same thing. And then the last is 32. So this kind of just visualization purposes, I know how far I am along. And this helps with actually the subnetting. So once you have this little chart going, we'll go ahead and take this number. So let's go ahead and find out what the subnet mask is. The first thing you do is you look at the /29, right? The CIDR notation. Remember we said that tells us what the subnet ID is, right? Or the network ID. So we need to find out what /29 is. So we take 29 and then we come down here and we look at this chart right here, right? So 29 is bigger than 8, right? Bigger than 16 and bigger than 24, but not bigger than 32. So what we do is we take 32, which is right here, okay, and we subtract 29 from it. Okay, that gives us 3. Alright, so we have 3. So the next thing you do is you look at the second row here, okay, that I created. So you take 2 and you raise it to the power of 3. Okay, and that equals, well, let's look at it. 1, 2, 3. That's 8. Okay, and you write down 8. So now we know this network, they increment in 8. Okay, so it's 8, and then we look at 8, and we look at 8 right above it, and that's 248, right? From the chart, that's 248. Well, there you go. That's your subnet mask. So it's 255.255.255.248, right? 8, and we just look at it right above it, 248. Simple. Why didn't I put 248 here in the third octet or the second octet? Well, we did that because remember 29, it says /29, right? So 29 is bigger than 8. It passes that first octet. It's bigger than 16. It passes the second octet. It's bigger than 24. It passes the third octet, right? So that tells me that the subnet ID is somewhere in the fourth octet, right? That's why I wrote down .48 in the last octet. That's how you'll know. Whichever octet the number resides in, that's the portion that you write down the number in. So 255, 255, 255.248. I hope that made sense. Okay, so now we need to find out what the network ID is. Well, we know that the network will increment by 8, right? So we can either write this down. So here, for example, I'll write down the IP is 168.173.70. Now here's the thing, 70.0, right? 168.173.70.8, because remember they increment by 8, right? And you just go down 16, 24, 32, 40, so on and so forth, right? Because they keep incrementing by 8. Well, the last ID, so the last IP is 134, right? 134. So let's take this and we keep going down. Okay, 48, 56, 72, and that's 136. And the next one is 144, right? 144. Well, we know that 134 resides in the 128 network, right? Because if you go over to 136, that means we went over one, right? So we know that the network ID is 168.173.70.128. 28. Okay. And if you don't have an Excel to plot this in, you can use a calculator. We know that increment by 8, so you can say 8 times 17 equals 136. Well, we're almost right there. 136 minus 8, 128. So you can use a calculator to figure this out as well. Okay, this is just for demonstration purposes. I put into Excel. So 128. So we know that the network ID is 128. So what's the next available IP? Remember, we can't use 128, right? So what's the next available IP? Well, the next available IP is just 1 over, right? So that would be 129. And the last available IP? Well, the last available IP would be, if the next one is 136, we subtract 2 from this, so 134. So this was the last ID, 134. So the broadcast ID is 168.173.135. Simple. Easy, right? So it's not that difficult. We find out what the subnet mask was. We found out what the first available IP is, what the network ID was, the last IP, and the broadcast IP. Okay, so we're going to do this IP. It's 153.34.173.2. Okay. Now, the method that I used will work for every single IP. Okay. So there's nothing to be afraid of if it's a bigger number or a smaller number. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look at the Saturn notation, the last, the slash 17, right? And we look at it. Is 17 bigger than 8? Yes, it is. Is 17 bigger than 16? Yes, it is. So that tells me that the subnet mask will be in the third octet, right? 17 comes right after 16. So is 17 bigger than 24? No, it's not. So we take 24, right? And we subtract 17 from it. What? That gives us 7. We take 2 and we raise it to the power of 7, and that gives us, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 128. That gives us 128. Okay, so we know that this network will have, this subnet is incrementing by 128. Okay, so it's 128, and I look at 128 and I look right above it. Okay, and that gives us the subnet mask. Now remember, we said this was in the third octet, right? So the subnet mask is 255.128.0. That's the subnet mask. Okay, so now we need to find out the network ID. So the network ID would be, if you look at our IP, it's 153.34.173.242. Well, if we go up to, we know that 173 is in between 128 and 256, right? So the network ID would be 128. Okay, 153.34.128.0. The first available host would be 153.34.128.1. Now remember, we can't use 0, right? So the next available is .1. And the last available host would be 153.34. Now remember, they increment by 128, so 256 is the next one. So one below 256 is 255, right? So 153.34, 255.254, right? And the broadcast ID would be, or the broadcast IP would be 153.34.256. 255.255. Okay, because that's the broadcast. Simple. It's easy and it's fun. And once you get the concept down, you'll never forget it, and you'll be able to do IP subnetting for any IP without any fear. I hope this tutorial helped you. Please subscribe. If you have any questions, comment on the video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good day.